I am here to talk about many perspectives of VR. Here we go. I think the slides are up. Okay. So VR is a general term that I'm here using about all kind of these immersive and mixed reality fields related to head-wearing devices that you put in your head. And this talk is about the different ways that VR has been used in the past, is used currently, and how you could use it in the future. And who I am, I'm Samuli Jääskeläinen. I work as a senior software engineer at Varjo, and I help our software partnerships. So I'm the guy that our partners call when they have technical questions about how to make amazing mixed reality experiences with our headsets. I'm also active FIVR member, so that's Finnish Virtual Reality Association. And in the Arabia here in Helsinki, there is a very good XR center filled with promising startups. And the whole VR industry and the ecosystem here at Finland is actually very unique. Not many countries have such a good support systems as our FIVR. And I would highly recommend looking into FIVR for anyone who is interested in looking deeper into this field. When I'm not pushing the boundaries of mixed reality at Varjo, I'm making games on my own time. And my history is in the game industry, and I studied game development at Kajaani. I've programmed anything from 80s vector arcade machines to quantum computers and anything in between. And VR just happens to be something that I built my professional career around. Few notes about the evolution of virtual reality and how have we ended up here where we currently are. So even before we had computers, we had the era of stereo photography. And in this era of stereo photography, we had stereo photograph and stereo video cameras. So there has always been this kind of like a fascination of like bringing immersive experiences from to other people in the world. And you could go like very, very back and think about the cave paintings with the fire and how the paintings are animating. That's like its own virtual reality of the time. So this is not a new concept, but now because of the technological advances, it's a little bit more easy to talk about virtual reality. In the early days, when 3D graphics were being done, like we hardly were able to even draw polygons. And at that point, people were thinking, okay, now we can render polygons, let's make them 3D, let's put them into the heads of the people. But we were too early. So this was era of failed R&D projects, secretive government things. NASA was doing a lot of things, but there wasn't like much practical use out of all of these. There was some things like Virtuality or Virtual Boy from Nintendo that were actually launched into products, but there was no this kind of like any product that was so successful that it would be alive here anymore. And that's why this is the early 3D era is kind of like seen as a failure. And it was such a big failure that people were like afraid of VR. And I'm still meeting some people who are burned from this era because they put so much effort and money and research into it. But we have moved past from this era. And the turning point was the Oculus Kickstarter. That's already many years ago. For me, it feels quite recent, but thinking of that, all of my professional career has basically started after that, so it's interesting timeline in that sense. And this was basically powered by the advanced in the mobile phone technology. So we finally got like small displays that had like high enough PPD, pixels per degree, that you could put them in next to your head, that you can actually see the image and it looks nice. And this first era of VR was quite successful. It was like the first time that we had actual consumer penetration in this market. But it was extremely niche. So at that point, it was still quite expensive to get these setups. You had to plug things into a PC or a console, and it may not be that super convenient. At the same time, there was this augmented reality getting introduced, and this is how people were thinking that the consumers want to use things, is that we have floating displays on top of real world. But that didn't kind of pan out very well, because it was quite difficult to technically get these floating displays on top of real world. So what the industry basically ended up doing is what here at Varjo we pioneered with our mixed reality headsets, and other have followed, like Apple and Meta in the years, which is that you add pass-through cameras. So you see a full VR experience, but you can augment that VR experience with the video feed from the real world. And this is what we usually call mixed reality nowadays. And good thing with these headsets is that they can do both. They can do VR and they can do mixed reality. And that's basically the current state of things, is that most devices can do both. They may be a little bit worse in one or other. It's usually that the mixed reality elements are a little bit limited, but at least you will get some kind of convenience pass-through to, for example, if your dog is eating your trash bin, you can like quickly see from the real world, even a black and white image, for example, with PSVR 2, and make sure that the trash is not spread around your apartment. And who is using these VR, AR, MR, XR, and all these terminology that is happening? I just generally just talk about VR. Some people talk about XR, some people wanna like really go into certain terms. I'm hearing when I'm talking about VR, I'm talking about all of this in general. And the first and the biggest user base currently are the gamers. And they are mostly focused in VR. There hasn't been many mixed reality experiences in gaming that have had much traction commercial-wise, or much like retention that people want to like actually play them for a longer time. So they are more have been these kind of like gimmicks. Whereas in VR, there are people who mainly play VR games, and that's the thing. About 2% of Steam users have a headset connected. People are often surprised. This is actually quite a big number. And Quest users, about 30% of Quest users are using it monthly. And thinking about how many different things nowadays we are fighting from our time during a day, these percentages are similar to what PlayStation and Nintendo has in their game consoles. So it's just one device fighting from your time like anything else. And there currently is already a proven market of people there, and a lot of gamers who enjoy these experiences. Then we have the general consumers and prosumers, and this is more of a people who don't do gaming but would use the headset for other things. And this market, unlike gamers, has not really been proven at all, because most people use other devices to do other things, and there hasn't been this kind of like a silver bullet of like, why would I wanna put the headset on to do some of these things? Maybe in an airplane or a bus or a train, it's nice to like get you away from the surrounding environment, but at home, these uses are very limited. The only place where I've seen some more traction here is the social applications, like VR chat, for example, which is one of the most used VR applications. And especially during pandemic times, a lot of people were replacing their like real life hangouts with the VR chat hangouts. But this overlaps with the gamer audience so much that basically every VR chat user is also a gamer. So I don't think there is that many users there that are just using it for social apps. They are also using it for gaming. Then we have the professionals. And for professionals, these devices are just a tool. So they have a job and they need to do something. So let's take, for example, law enforcement. They might take a photogrammetry from a drone of a crime scene. So they have a recording of that. And then, of course, you need to clean up the crime scene. But after that, because you have the photogrammetry recorded of the crime scene, you can put the headset on and walk into the recorded crime scene and see what was happening there. And even use those kind of things in a process of prosecuting people. So professionals are not looking into VR in a way that like, hey, this is a cool thing. They have a problem and they need a solution. And that's why in engineering and architects, they also like using VR because that's one of the best ways of visualizing things. You can feel the scale, you can see different angles, you can imagine a car designer doing a ray traced reflections from the paint of the car to see how the sun reflects from the properties. These are the kind of like things that they wanna test with the headset. They wanna go deep and they have a job to do. So for them, it's just another tool in a box, and it's proven to be quite powerful and quite useful tool. Then training. And training and simulation is something that I'm the most familiar with because at Varjo, that's our main bread and butter. For example, in ITSEC, which is the primary training and simulation show in US, most of the headsets on the show floor are Varjo because this is the segment where we shine. And this segment really is pushing for mixed reality. And this is because when you are training with real equipment, you want to see the real equipment. You don't want to be using some controllers to interact with buttons that don't have any physicality, because you don't want to do what is called negative training. You want to train with the actual equipment, with the actual joystick, with the actual throttle, actual wheel. And that's why mixed reality has been really important, because it's not just that you want to touch that wheel, you also wanna see the controls when you are training. But then again, you want to replace these projectors or displays with something that is more immersive, like a mixed reality headset. And then lastly, and definitely not least, is the academic use, and that's actually where the whole VR industry started. It was first in the academics, and people were doing prototypes in a lab. And currently, in the academic use, the most that I've seen is in the cognitive research. So, for example, you combine the headset with the neural interface, IgG, or you use the built-in eye tracking of the headsets to get data from the eyes. So you get like really close to the people. And this is where these devices have been used in the academics. Of course, there's a lot of other kind of academic research going on as well, but that's what I've seen the primary use cases in the recent years. Then the actual perspectives of VR. I've been talking about the history perspective, and I'm thinking about the different industry perspective, but what are the perspectives of you when you're using the VR? And that's something that people don't often think when they are thinking VR, is that it's not all first person. There is also plenty of third person experiences. But let's first talk about these first person experiences, where they are very personal, they are very in your face. And currently when you are doing these, even though we've had these motion controllers since Wii, there is still no standards. There are evolving standards. There are always someone thinks about something cool and other games copy it. But it's not same as with PlayStation 5 that you grab a controller and every game kind of controls the same. So we are kind of in a transition period. So if you think about the history, when the 3D games first came out with the PlayStation 1, every game had a different way of controlling camera. It was madness. We have gone past that. We are basically currently in the, what I would say, PlayStation 2 era, where some cameras and some controls are same, but not all, because not everyone has really still figured out how to do these things. And it's very interesting area of game design. So if you are interested in game design and controller and player interfaces, this is currently a very fascinating area, because there is a lot of innovation that you can do and a lot of different solutions that you can like check that people have done in the past. And that's why I added this image here that has like a bunch of different controllers, because that's the reality. Depending on the game, you should target different kind of devices and different kind of controllers. And obviously you cannot support everything at the same time in the same game. So you need to pick and choose a little bit. Like one thing that I personally play a lot is actually like I might mod some older game and just play with keyboard and mouse. But That's not something that many people do, and that wouldn't be commercially viable. But it's just that you should always think that what is the way of controlling. Whereas here in the third person, they are the familiar controls. You have usually a gamepad in your hands, and you're controlling some avatar, and you have full expectation how it's supposed to behave. Then one thing when you are doing, especially first-person experiences, is because of the elevated immersion, you want the player to keep immersed in the application. You should think about all the UI and all the actions that, if they look incorrect, it will break the player out from the game or the user from the experience. And quite often, it's actually easier for our brains to understand abstractions than realism that is a little bit broken. So cut off hands from here and don't try to render your whole arm, because the arm often is not in a correct position that your own arm. Maybe add gloves so you don't wonder why your skin color is different in VR. You need to think all of these kind of things around. And many of the UI elements, they just can't be floating holograms or all kind of things. People will accept them really, really fast into the imagination and in the world. But if you try to mimic real world too much, then you are bringing elements from the real world into the game, and you will start to expect things to work like the real world. And that's very difficult to make in practice. And that's why many VR games might look a little bit cartoony, or like VR chat there, for example. It's like very simplistic looking, and that's mostly because you still get the elevated immersion, but it may not look that immersive in the screenshot. And one note about first-person things here that I wanted to highlight is that it's easily scary, because you are in the first person, you are yourself there. So many things that are not scary in a traditional game can be very scary and very strong in VR. And that's something that you should always think of, that if you don't want your game to be scary, you need to be extra careful. And that's why there's a lot of VR horror games, because it's very easy to do it. And for me personally, I think only LARPing has been more immersive than VR. So it can easily be very scary. And lastly, about the third person is that you can sometimes use these both in the same game, because the third person is way better for spectators, because there is not this constant head moving and what is happening in the head movement. That if you have the camera for spectators in third person, like for example you are playing Beat Saber or some game, it's stable and it stays in one position, and then you can just see the player moving around. And that's a good way of how people are streaming VR experiences, or how you should think when you are designing these things. That the third person may not actually be for the player, it may just be for the spectators. And then a few notes. I didn't want to just leave you hanging about all these different perspectives. It's practical things, like how do you create comfortable experiences in VR? So simulation sickness is mainly the thing that people are always worried. And I have some good news and some bad news for people. So good news is that hardware itself doesn't really cause simulation sickness anymore. Hardware is good enough. It's the software. And the software design is fully in your hands when you are doing and programming your application. And you need to be careful about this thing. And mostly what triggers the simulation sickness is artificial movements. So when you are moving the camera, but not the body. And this mismatch causes your lizard brain to think that you are drugged or poisoned or whatever, and you get nauseated. This is different from motion sickness. So simulation sickness can exist without motion sickness, and motion sickness can exist without simulation sickness. So if you're immune to one, you may not be immune to other. Good thing is that the more you use VR, your body will adapt. But whenever you feel sick, just remove the headset, have a break, and maybe continue tomorrow. There are different methods of compensating for this one then, and many games provide things like teleportation or snap turning, or they reduce the field of view when you are moving, or they have a cockpit around the player to like ground them into a moving experience. So if you are making a game, you should think about all of these, but don't let them restrict what you want to do, because there is already a proven portion of players and people who are so used to VR that basically only thing that makes them sick is performance that is bad in the game. So FPS drops and like stutteriness that you should always avoid. But in doing so, you should think that there is less people that then can play your game because they will have some sort of simulation sickness there. So most of the large games and experiences in VR currently use teleportation, but then they might have optional ways of having this artificial movement in the game. One thing I point always is to minimize annoyance and frustration, because if you have like frustrating things like menus that don't work, buttons that don't act the way, you will start like feeling sick even outside of VR. So that can really quickly elevate like all kind of like frustration, this simulation sickness. So often all the UI and gaming experience in VR should be maybe even a little bit smoother than in normal gaming, which is difficult when you have controllers that don't have proven UIs yet. So this is an interesting challenge there. For mixed reality, it can help to ground the user. So for example, if you press pause, you might want to see the real world, so you can reorient yourself. And this can help with the simulation sickness. And as I said, seasoned users are mostly immune. People who have been developing for VR for a long time, like me, I don't even get sick from low frame rates anymore. But that's oddity. I think there's something wrong with my brain at the moment. Then time of use. So when you're first starting VR and making experiences for people who have not used it for a long time, maybe 15 mission sessions. It shouldn't be too long. You should be getting used to the headset. But then there are people who like fly cross-Atlantic flights in Microsoft Flight Simulator that take like 10 hours. And that's totally doable and fine as well. You maybe want to get a straw to your drink because it's easier to drink a coffee with a straw because the headset is otherwise in your coffee's way. But you have little practical problems like that when you're spending 10 hours in VR. I think I've also like maybe 8 or 9 hours is longest that I have spent, so it's doable. But it's not something that people often do like regularly. And then minimize the unnecessary movement. So people are lazy. They don't want to move around. Unless you are doing Beat Saber or some kind of like exercise game, you want to like minimize movement. Many games even have like crouch keys, even though you could crouch in the real world. You are not there to make squats, you are there to game. And if you need to crouch in a game as many times as you crouch in like your basic CS match, your like leg days are like getting more common. So there was this one meme in one shooting game community in VR where they said like that the VR game is always VR day is a leg day because they were crouching so much. But nowadays games are finding different ways. And that was my introduction to current state of VR and what's happening in the VR world and different views and perspectives around it. Thank you. And I hope you have enjoyable, I guess, game jams coming.
Thank you, Samuli, so much. This is very informative. It's good to have this kind of recheck. We've had like podcast talking, and then you're like 8 to 9 years ago, you had one of the VR sessions. So things have changed, obviously.
Yes.
So it's good to come back, even though it's like sort of like a slow trend. So there is nothing that comes through the press that often. So we don't get reminded of the VR trend that much. So that's a little bit like sort of like people that follow the trend, they know the things, but then we can forget it if we don't follow it all the time. How do you yourself, as a Varjo engineer, do you follow the games, VR games scene a lot?
I follow it a little bit. I don't play all the new releases and try these things, so I'm always a little bit behind. But especially in the hardware side, I'm following all the new consumer hardware. Yeah. Game design-wise, I would say that I'm not 100% up to date with all the crazy new innovations that people are every month putting into their games.
Do you, in terms of your job, because you're in a simulation area for the like training things and those kind of things that are more like serious use of Varjo's headset, but do you follow simulation games? You mentioned the transatlantic flying and those kind of things that I don't know too much about, but do you follow specifically that area or just anything?
I specifically follow that area, and it's not just the training and simulation. Also, I get this kind of professional use of technologies in general, and finding ways where you can basically deprecate old ways of doing and replace them with the newer, improved ways of doing.
Right. In terms of like, this is also similar to what Abhishek was talking about in the exagaming field. This is also a little bit like a bit perhaps outskirts in the industry that we like mainly talk about. But is there other venues? You mentioned that there's this simulation fair that you go to. Is it something that we can follow in the press? Where do we get the information about what's happening in that training area if we are interested as game developers to follow also that side?
Yeah, so that would be something that you would need to basically find out what are these GDC of training and simulation, like that the ITSEC that we are going, for example, kind of is. But many of them are a little bit more secretive because there is government contracts and all these kind of things. So you may need to already have a company before you can enter those exhibitions, or that they have a different day for students.
Right.
That may have a little bit different exhibitions, and then the exhibitors know that this is now the public day.
So what are we like? Where are we standing in the training in terms of like not VR also then? That what's happening in that space currently? Is it all VR?
No, it's not all VR.
Yeah.
Obviously, as I was saying, that the negative training one is something that people want to avoid, so they want to use like real devices. So it's always more and more building these kind of like real world tools. But what people often want to do is mobile setups. Their systems may not be like permanently in one warehouse, but they want to move them depending on the need, or even sometimes have home setups for like pilots and people like that. So I think this kind of like the movability and how easy to package things is this kind of trend that I'm seeing in that area. Another thing that I'm seeing that there is a lot of like this hardware knowledge there.
Yeah.
But coming from the game industry background, I see a lot of things where like the technical solutions, especially like graphics-wise, are behind what game industry is doing. Because graphics are often not the primary thing, but it's a nice to have thing on top of these kind of simulators. But often in the end, people who are doing the decisions and buying these systems, they see the fancy graphics, so they they like to buy it. So there is this need for this kind of like game industry talent in this sector as well.
Yeah.
And then there are companies that have leg in both, like Bohemia Interactive or DCS. These both have like games in Steam, and then Finnish military is using them as well. So it's they have like their own systems in both worlds.
In the presentation, you had an example of the crime investigators. So that was a new thing. Do you know for sure that that's actually used by crime investigators?
By
that's the real case.
Finnish police.
Finnish ones. Yes. Okay, Finnish police. Oh, that's super interesting. So I had a question from an audience here, which is not the big one since we are fully online, but how does nausea compare in first person versus third person in VRs, and do you have tips to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in third person, it's usually a little bit less because it's more like watching a 3D movie, but you still should be like thinking about the movement of the camera. So most third-person VR games, the camera only moves like forward and back, or maybe up and down. It doesn't rotate. That's the one that usually like causes a lot more nausea. So just going back and forward is usually quite natural for us, even if it's an artificial movement.
Right.
And many third-person games, they don't move the camera at all. So it's a little bit like the old-school Resident Evil. You have one position for the camera, and there is the character, but the difference is that now you can move your head around, and if you want to get closer to the play area, you just like physically go closer to the play area. So it's more like a diorama that you play.
Right. So we are going to have a game jam here, and you've done how many jams so far? 130?
Yes,
130?
something like that.
So you've done also VR projects in your jams. What would you do now? What would be the VR, XR, AR game jam project that you would do on this week if you would jam now?
So if I would most likely do some kind of like experiences playing around with the controllers and interfaces, because that's the fun design field of that area. And one thing that I also like to often look into some games that I have liked, but there is not yet VR equivalent of those games, and then play around with like how can I transfer this experience that I liked without VR into VR.
Right.
And in the early days, when I was playing around with like Oculus dev kits, when we didn't have motion controllers, I actually did many things like that. I made one of the first, even if not the first, third-person platformer in VR. I made a first VR comic in VR. I made a first VR rhythm game in VR, and that rhythm game was super funny because I was like, this is gonna be big. And then Beat Saber game was like, yeah, I was right. VR rhythm gaming was big. That's basically now one of the main things that people use it for.
So do you think that, because it's a fully online jam now, do you think that VR, like what is your tips for online VR jamming?
So for online VR jamming, the thing here would be that not everyone may not have the headset. So then the player with headset needs to give more input of how things feel.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things like art and audio and a lot of programming also that you can do without the headset or with the emulator. So there are these headset emulators for people who are developing without headsets as well. But at least one person, and preferably he would be also a programmer, should have the headset, because there is many of these kind of technical issues and things that you cannot really test and solve without the actual hardware. And there are some fun things that we have noticed. For example, before Varjo, I was working at Mindfield Games, which used to be the biggest VR game studio in Finland, where we basically we took a Biltema, this kind of like, or you could take an IKEA catalog, and you check like, how big is a chair? And you literally use those dimensions to model the chair, because that's how it's supposed to be in VR, and then it fits. But then we scaled up everything like 10% maybe, have this kind of, so they felt a little bit more grounded in the world. But in many ways you should check like real world scale, especially as an artist. And same goes with the audio design, is that look these kind of like real world examples of things that they are maybe a little bit more, it makes a little bit more sense. Whereas in traditional, like if you're making a third-person shooter, all the doors are enormous in video games because you need to get the guy and the camera through them. Don't do that in VR because it just feels silly.
Yeah. All right, so I have so many other questions, but thank you so much, Samuli, once again to tell us about VR stuff, and hopefully we'll see you in one of the jams.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yes, okay, well, you have actually, we're going to reveal your role in this jam later, but thank you for joining. Thank you.